First day, and then I usually do. Let me talk to you about a few minutes about what is intellectual history, and then I'll talk to you for a few minutes about what is modernity. So intellectual history is an interdisciplinary field. So a lot of people say, well, is it history? Is it philosophy? Is it history of philosophy? You know, is it comparative literature with a lot of theory thrown in? It's kind of on, it's on the borders of all those things. It's inherently interdisciplinary, so it's inherently going to cross those boundaries. The way most of the readings that we will be doing are readings that are more typical of text you will get in literature and philosophy departments than in text you would normally study in history departments. What is distinctive is that we study them from a different perspective. And it's a very explicitly historical perspective. Which is that the ideas, it's a history of ideas, but it's not a history of ideas in the abstract, it's a history of ideas in context. So what you will see in these lectures, which is typical of the field as a whole, is a constant meandering back and forth and swimming around between the abstract, the ethereal, the metaphysical, and the concrete and the empirical. And that is the nature of intellectual history. Because the approach that historians have to the same text that philosophers work on is that texts were always produced by real people in a real time, in a real place. We'll get to Kant. We'll start to get to Kant actually on Friday. Kant has various ideas about what he calls the transcendental conditions for the possibility of knowledge, two of which are time and space. And he says, we need time and space in order to be able to process any kind of input we get from the world at all. And in a metaphorical way, those are also the necessary conditions of possibility for the study of history, time and place. Everything happens in a time and a place. So I'm going to constantly, there'll be times when we're like in this language that seems extremely vague and abstract and ethereal, but we're always going to come back to a real time and a real place and real lives. So they're always real people. They're always real people, and those people are never perfect. Perfection exists only in the realm of the theoretical. It doesn't exist in the realm of the real. We are always dealing with highly imperfect people, often quite morally dubious people. That's what we do in history. That is the condition of the world. So these ideas are always going to be put in context. They're always going to be put in the context of real people's lives. Those lives are always going to be highly imperfect. There's a quote that I really like, but by a very obscure Polish Marxist philosopher named Stanislaw Brzozowski, who managed to die at the age of 33 before he had a chance to get his hands dirty. And in 1911, in one of his last diary entries, he wrote, "What is not biography is nothing at all." And that is more or less the point of departure. For me, for intellectual history. What is not biography is nothing at all. We're always in the lives of real people. Anything that doesn't involve the lives of real people is a kind of abstraction from real life, and I'm going to keep trying to bring you back to real life. Now let me make before I go into the distinction more so between philosophers and intellectual historians, let me go into a further distinction between continental and analytical philosophy. So there is a big split in philosophy as a field, more or less at the beginning of the 20th century. Anglo-Saxon or American and British philosophy went largely in the direction of analytical philosophy, which is the dominant kind of philosophy taught in our department here, for instance, whereas in France and Germany and Eastern Europe, there was still a lot more continental philosophy. There are still big debates about what the distinction is, but I'm going to give you my very short version now. So analytical philosophy is a lot closer to math and logic. It's a lot more technical. Continental philosophy has much more of a kind of historical consciousness. It's closer to literature. it embodies and deals with things that don't work logically or that continue to inhabit contradictions in a way that analytical philosophy decides it really can't tolerate contradictions. And my colleague Tamar Gendler can speak about this very well too. She thinks that's the critical distinction is, can you tolerate contradictions? Can you not tolerate contradictions? My colleague Peter Gordon feels like the critical distinction is, do you have a sense of history in philosophy that's continental? Have you completely bracketed history out? That's analytical. And I'll keep coming back to this distinction, but what you should know for these purposes is that almost all of the philosophy we deal with in this course is continental, or at least in its continental interpretation, because we're always dealing with the historically inflected part of these kind of philosophical ideas. If you take courses with some of my colleagues, like Shelley Kagan, who is a wonderful lecturer, who is an analytical philosopher, you'll read some of the same people that you're reading in this course in a very, very different way. When you listen to Professor Kagan lecture, it's like, Heidegger, Aristotle, and Spinoza can all be on the stage at the same time. It doesn't matter who they were, where they were, when they lived. There's an argument they're making, and that argument is either consistent and it works, or it doesn't work. And anything else is completely irrelevant, and it's more than irrelevant. It should be purged because it contaminates the philosophical argument. History is all contaminated. There's no decontamination of history. It's all this kind of messiness. So no one gets to be kind of on stage at the same time. Everyone is always situated in a certain place. In analytical philosophy, you'll hear a phrase, genealogical fallacy. Genealogical fallacy is when you try to interpret the philosophy through biographical or historical details. There's no such thing in history as a genealogical fallacy because everything is about real life. I'll give you one more example. So my colleague Jason Stanley, who is a fantastic teacher, and you should all take a class from him as well, also comes from an analytical philosophy tradition, is a philosopher of language. And when I first met him here years ago, we were talking about ways in which we try to help our students understand various kinds of philosophical ideas. And I told him about some of the analogies and metaphors I was using. And he said, "You tell stories about your children to illustrate philosophical points?" And I said, "Well, yes, of course. I mean, how do you do it? What do you do to illustrate philosophical points?" And he said, "Well, in analytical philosophy, we have all sorts of examples. For instance, we ask the students to imagine that the brain is in a vat." And I said, "But the brain is never in a vat." I mean, how can that be relevant? Because you can never actually take your brain out of your head and put it in a vat. But that's the kind of thing analytical philosophers do to kind of purify. We never purify in history. History is just impure. It's messy. It's often ugly. That is its natural state. No purification process is possible. The brain is never in a vat. There are no ideas existing outside of time and place and human lives. Now, the other thing that inflects the difference between philosophy then and history, in addition to that we're dealing more with continental and less with analytical philosophy, is that the perspective from which historians approach philosophy and the perspective from which I'll be teaching this class is that it's not about who was right. It's about trying to understand what people were trying to do. You're not going to find out, well, maybe you will, but you're not going to find out, like, okay, well, Aristotle was right and Heidegger was wrong, or Arendt was right and Heidegger was wrong, and now we know the answers and we can solve all the great mysteries of human existence and we could just go home. If I knew the answers to solve the great mysteries of human existence, I would happily tell you and we could all go home and then play softball or do something else. But the point about intellectual history is that the conversations go on and on and on because the answers are never satisfactorily found. It's the history more of questions than of answers. And one of the things I want you to see is how the questions shift. They generally never get answered in a satisfactory way, but the questions start being differently inflected. So I'm going to try to help you make a kind of imaginative leap into the minds of these thinkers we're studying and try to understand what they were trying to do They all had their pet obsessions. They were all trying to figure out certain things. They all had their own complexes. They were all responding to the dramas and the tragedies and the angst of their own moment and their own lives. And I'm going to try to help you kind of empathetically imagine what they were trying to do. All of them in various ways fail. It's the history much more of error and of failure than it is of success. You know, no one has saved the world. I mean, the world would look a lot differently if somebody had saved it. Nobody has saved the world. But I'm going to try to help you see what they were trying to do and how they were trying to do it. Intellectual history is a history of conversations. In that sense, any place you start is a bit arbitrary. You're always coming into a conversation that's always ongoing. It keeps going, and more people join it. And some people drop out, and then other people join it, and or the conversation splits up into different directions, and this circle goes over here, and that circle goes over there. But it's constantly moving. There's no kind of pure moment where some idea was produced in isolation. Everything in various ways is dialogical. And I'll maybe tell you a small anecdote to illustrate this on ideas and cosmopolitanism. So years ago, I was giving a talk in Łódź in Poland. It must have been, I was wearing my son in a baby carrier for this talk, and he grabbed the microphone from my hand. So it must have been 2011. And there was a young student there, a young Polish leftist student at this talk in Poland. And afterwards, he came over to me and he said, you know, I had this question that I really wanted to ask you, but I was too embarrassed to ask in front of the whole audience. Can I ask you now? And I said, sure, go ahead. And he said, well, listening to you talk, what I worry about is that these ideas and these philosophical traditions and these currents that I'm interested in, maybe they do really all come from foreigners. You know, maybe the right-wing nationalist in Poland who I hate, this is like a young leftist student, maybe they have a point. Maybe the things that are authentically really Polish are not what I like. You know, maybe those of us on the left really are attracted to things that are foreign. And how I answered him is that it was not the right way to pose the question. Because the idea that there's some set of ideas that are purely X or purely Y that have been created in the minds in a kind of tabula rasa ex nihilo from somebody who has never read anybody, who has never read anybody, who has never read anybody, it's an epistemological fantasy. That's not actually the way ideas move in the world. Everything is much messier. Borders get crossed. They get crossed again and again and again. People have layers of subliminal influences on themselves. There are no thinkers kind of creating in that black box in which they've always lived ex nihilo. Ideas are always moving around. They're always crossing borders. They're always picking up contingent and arbitrary and accidental things depending on the weather, depending on who else stops by the cafe that day, depending on who misses a boat or a train or an airplane, depending on who has read what book at what moment. So we can't actually perform purification exercises on real life. Conversations go on. They're complicated, and they can't be disentangled in that way. Okay, what else do I want to tell you before I tell you a couple things about modernity? As you see, that also implies there's an infinite regression problem because there's no clean point from which to begin. Historians always have an infinite regression problem. Like really, in order to understand Stalinism, you have to understand Lenin. In order to understand Lenin, you have to understand Marx. In order to understand Marx, you have to understand Hegel. In order to understand Hegel, you have to understand Kant. And so it keeps going and going and going. So any place you start has a bit of an arbitrary quality to it, which is why I start with these general overview lectures, which are imperfect, but the best I've come up with. The other thing I want you to think about is that many of these thinkers and these same ideas can be interpreted in radically different ways and used for completely antithetical purposes. You know, that is the nature of ideas. That people pick them up and do things with them that their authors never intended. That's what history is. That's how it moves. The author of a text never gets a monopoly on the interpretation of a text. That text is out there, and people take it in the directions they will. There's an argument to be made that the entire history of French existentialism is based on Sartre's misreading of Heidegger. Perhaps. But that doesn't mean you cross out French existentialism as if it never happened, because it went off in its own direction. People take things in their own direction. And that's why it's so interesting. The other thing I guess I should mention before I talk to you about modernity, which is probably obvious, but I'm going to mention it anyway, is that sadistic lunatics often can and do play major historical roles. The fact that somebody was a lunatic doesn't mean that they did not play a historical role. So there's, for instance, my philosopher colleagues have long been engaged in a big debate about, should we teach certain people because they were Stalinist or because they were Nazis or because they did. I can't take those people out of history, because history is not just the history of people who were nice. So if I took out the people who were not nice, I couldn't teach you history at all. History is full of horrible, disturbing things. It unfortunately continues to be full of horrible, disturbing things.